Hi, everybody. Good morning, and thank you all for joining today's webinar. I'll be your host today. My name is Matthew Williams, and I'm the MD of Cuba Digital. We're a development agency based in sunny Sheffield, which in fact it is today for a change, in Yorkshire. So today's webinar is part of our stacked series of events. It's a series that sets out to explore the trends and issues facing clients and agencies alike that want to deliver successful digital projects. So the format for these events is to bring together thought leaders from a range of industries and get the inside track on key digital topics, sharing their real-world experiences with us. Today we've got about an hour, so please feel free to raise any questions in the chat throughout the session. Just a little bit about today's event. I don't know about you, but I find generally we all like to talk about how successful our projects have been and what great results they're delivering. Agencies are fantastic in particular at doing this. But in reality, rarely does everything run to plan, especially in larger, more complex digital projects. In fact, according to research, on average, the failure rate of larger projects in tech is in the region of plus 20%. That's a huge amount. At Cuba, we frequently take on what we call recovery projects, where something's gone wrong and project needs rescuing and getting back on track. And in many of these cases, it's clear that the risks just haven't been considered from the outset. So today, we thought it'd be great to explore what you can do to de-risk your next digital project and ultimately ensure success. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our esteemed panel. First of all, we have Janet Fiander, Senior Manager, Client Experience and Marketing at HSBC Innovation Banking Division. Hi, Janet.
Hey, Matthew. It's nice to be here today, having a chat with you about such an important topic.
I'm extremely pleased that you could join us today. Next, we have Richard Adams, Head of Digital Architecture at LNER, London North Eastern Railway. Hi, Richard. How are you doing?
Morning all. Happy as Larry. It's very sunny.
Indeed.
And it's finally stopped raining.
I love your background. I love the environment you're working in there. And we also have Thomas Melinar, Head of Digital Marketing at Dechra Pharmaceuticals PLC, a global business specializing in veterinary products. Hi, Thomas. How are you doing?
Hi, morning, everybody. I'm doing well, thank you. How are you, Matt?
Yeah, I'm very good indeed, thanks.
Good.
Okay, so just to get us kicked off and to know each other a little better, it'd be great if each of you could just quickly outline your role and perhaps briefly summarize a recent project that you've delivered. So Jeanette, if you could start us off, please, that'd be great.
100%. So my role is Senior Manager CX and Marketing at HSBC Innovation Banking. That means I get the joy of being the conscience of the business, for want of a better word, where we match the why of why we're in business with the how, in terms of how we actually deliver out projects, in particular products and services. What have I been doing in the digital space? Well, this is really interesting. So I have the joyous mix of both being client facing as well as agency facing. So I understand this particular subject really well from two sides. Two big projects that I'd like to highlight. One that went really, really well was a customer loyalty app that we built. The reason why it went really, really well is that we took a lot of time to understand not just the expressed need from a client perspective, but the implied as well. So understanding that deeper layer and use a lot of design thinking throughout the process to deliver it. One that didn't go too well was actually an employee app. The reason why that didn't go too well is it was driven by process optimization in terms of how to constrain or how to reduce specific resources in a specific area by transferring the behavior onto the employee. And of course, when employees have to do more without understanding the value, or in fact, any human has to do more without understanding the value, that never goes down too well. So yeah, looking forward to hearing from my other panelists. I'm sure they've got lots of interesting projects they can share as well. Thanks, Matthew.
Thank you. Over to you, Richard.
Yeah, I've got an interesting mixed background. I started life as an artist, hence all this, and started working with tech 30 years ago to make art, which is how I got into tech. And gradually over time, I've done all sorts of things as tech has emerged. I've worked at the Royal Shakespeare Company, BBC, Sky, Microsoft, Xbox, loads of places in different roles, all about emerging new technology to allow people to do things. So with games and with content that's easily accessible, etc., whether that be on the web or whether it be on console or whether it be whatever. So I've ended up at LNER. LNER created a digital and innovation department 3 or 4 years ago. And one of the early members of that, my responsibility in LNER is to lead the direction of travel in terms of the technology we use. And that's mainly in the background, supporting everything, supporting the websites, the apps, the retail systems and everything. So in the last 3 years, I've managed to push through a complete cloud transformation from tin to cloud in almost every area, and rebuilt the technology stacks that things like our communications channels are built on, really. And now I'm doing some consultancy at GBR on the retail aspects of GBR, which if you don't know what that is, that's Great British Railways, which is a sort of new centralizing body and standard setting body for the rail industry, designed to make things simpler for the customer. I'll hand it over to Thomas.
Yes, hi again, everybody. I'm Thomas Mola. I'm the head of digital marketing at Dechra Pharmaceuticals. Like Richard, I also have a background in the arts, but as an art historian rather than an artist, which usually are the people who aren't really good enough to get into an art academy go study art history instead. I've been working in the digital space for about a decade now, and I'm currently at Dechra as the head of digital marketing, working in customer experience, but also channel engagement and data projects. I mean, there's so many things to do, I think, in digital usually, that's probably one of your biggest challenges, as well as managing multiple projects at the same time. Where I think, to give an example of a project that we're currently working on that we're very excited about, which is our new kind of overall website rebuild, we have worked together with an external agency, which is going very, very well. When we started the project, we didn't have some internal capabilities that then halfway through the project we did have, and that all of a sudden slowed things down. So it was a good and a bad thing in terms of, we asked this agency to develop some IT solutions for us that we weren't able to develop ourselves. And the IT team decided to invest in getting those capabilities on board, which is great, but then also kind of set us back in terms of the delivery of the project as well. So I think, sometimes what seems like a bump in the road can also be a good thing in the long term.
Yeah, good point. Okay, thank you very much for introducing yourselves and telling us a bit about what you've been doing. I thought it'd be good to kick off to really start with what we call project initiation, I guess. How does a project come about? Because I think, particularly when you work in agencies, you only get involved in a project at pitch stage or proposal, and a lot's happened before that, obviously. So it would be really interesting to find out how you manage risk in the early stages, I guess, of a project, in terms of managing stakeholders, doing the right research, and moving it, getting the budget, and setting goals before you even start getting into the project delivery. So if it's okay, Thomas, I'd like to start with you, because you mentioned you've done a big web project recently. How did that kind of come about in the early stages?
So I think that came about, there's multiple factors that led us to kind of start investigating the project itself, and a lot of it was based on some of the technology components, but also very much internal, I'd say, internal opinions or internal takes on how the current experience was working. And what we really wanted to do was saying, before we actually started the project, we did a big customer research project instead to see, well, is this actually giving our customers what they need? Are there things missing? And are we actually, completely blind to some big holes in our customer experience before really committing to, a long-term web project in that way? So it was really for us to understand customer needs first and seeing, is there a basis to start this project before we really initiated the project?
Yeah, makes perfect sense. Jeanette, is that similar experience for you at HSBC? Is that where you start, or?
100%. I think the sheer fact that I sit in client experience or customer experience really grounds me in terms of the beginning stage of any project that we take on board, and not just at HSBC Innovation Banking, but at any business that I've actually worked in. I think being that champion which says you have to start with the need, or what we would call in client experience terms, the jobs to be done, which is a colloquial term essentially for what is it that a client wants to get through this particular endeavor, and balance that with the business need. So the best project delivery has always been where it ticks both those boxes. I think that the danger, of course, is where it only ticks one of them. And you can either have poor engagement from a customer, or, I mean, when I talk about a customer, that can also be an internal stakeholder. So it's quite a broad term. Or you get, fans of the platform, but there's a questionable business case in the background. So I think making sure, and I love what Tomas is talking about, because he talks a lot about, he talked earlier about him being part of the digital kind of experience team, driving that out, and Richard talks about it a lot as well. But they both inherently understand that you've got to start with who is consuming this particular platform, and if you don't do that due diligence right up front, you're in for trouble later on in the project.
Yeah. Richard, I mean, I imagine that's the same for you, but in terms of how you manage senior stakeholders in terms of, for a large project at LNER, how do you kind of manage their expectations, I guess, throughout the start of a project, and throughout?
Sorry, I got mute on. Classic. It's not just about the stakeholders in a company like LNER. It reminds me very much of working on Microsoft Xbox One, that your customers are so involved in the process, they get emotional. So when at Xbox One we launched that with a Connect, which looked at you and allowed you to do a visual interface and stuff, gamers swore blind it wasn't as responsive as the handheld console. And on every test we did, we knew it was. Right? So there was no delay. It was a perceived delay, but they just wouldn't have it. So it's gone. It's gone as an option. And I think when you come to rail, the feelings rail travel engenders in people is quite astonishing. They shout at you, they talk to you, they laugh at you, they complain like hell, So there's that huge chunk of customer experience that is visceral. You're not passively just buying a box of tissues from Amazon or whatever. You're actually about to get on a train, travel, and you're worried that your tickets aren't right and all of that sort of stuff. So when you do a website or an app or anything, you've kind of got to have that in mind to an equal level of satisfying the senior stakeholders. I mean, we are state-owned at the minute, so the senior stakeholders are really the DFT. And the DFT, I think, as long as the rail's running and complaints are going down and performance is going up, that's that's all they want to see. But the customers, I think, are the key thing. And I think it reminds me very much of gamers. They're very volatile. They're very loud. One person can take up half a day on Twitter, and it's just one person who's got something wrong. And you just have to go with it. So the art of designing things is often as much about reassurance as it is about giving them information. And you're reassuring them this is the right ticket to buy. So when you design a website, that's got to be involved in it. Now, I'm not sure we've got it right. We're continually changing and working on it, but that's the way we're going. We're trying to lay out all the complicated ticket options. And it is complicated. I looked at a database the other day, and there are 3,500 ticket types in the UK. And our site has to sell them all. And then there are rail cards, and then there are this, that, and the other. So there's an awful lot of variance that can affect your price. And so you've got to work at reassurance, I think, in something like this, much more than necessarily visual design. You can't take the visual design. That's a silly statement. You can't take the visual design away, but the reassurance is almost a central core of what you're trying to do.
Yeah, yeah. That's interesting. So, I mean, it kind of leads us into, because that takes a lot of research and planning, I imagine, which kind of takes us into the next question I wanted to ask, which is really at the kind of what we call the discovery stage at Cuba, but it's planning essentially. It's early doors discovery work. And what I wanted to try and find out from you is, you know, when you're going into that stage and you're thinking about risk management, what are the key things you want to understand in discovery that will help reduce risk, but also obviously ensure strategic success? So Jeanette, if I could ask you first of all, because I know that you're obviously focused on user experience a lot, and that's a big part of discovery. So
yeah, and what Richard was saying a moment ago is absolutely true. So there's fear attached to a lot of online purchase decisions, right? So have I got the right thing? You know, what does it look like? And there's many nudges along the journey, but you can only do that by doing experience design properly and understanding and circling back to test and iterate. But to answer your question, Matthew, around, you know, what do you need to do in the discovery phase? For me, there are a couple of absolutes which I found work in different depths across different organizations I've worked with. My first absolute is stakeholder mapping. And I find that without doing stakeholder mapping, and this is more for an internal view than an external view, obviously you want to go to your customers. And as I talked earlier, a little bit earlier about doing jobs to be done, what is it a customer actually wants to do? And that can be implied, it can be inferred. If you're clever enough, you can do some predictive analytics around, you know, what is it that they may want to do and they don't quite currently know about it right now. And there's a whole different subject that we can have a completely different webinar on just that matrix alone. But stakeholder mapping internally, I think, is often overlooked as being a tick box exercise. And the challenge here, where an agency is concerned, where they are being brought in to do a piece of work, is they don't always have sight of the internal kind of stakeholder matrix. And quite often, the project teams don't have the depth of knowledge either. And I'm going to say this quite broadly, particularly in very big legacy businesses, which are pretty much the majority of the businesses that I've ever either consulted to or worked for. So what happens is if that stakeholder mapping is not done properly from day one, in conjunction with your design agent or your design team or your digital rollout team that you bring in, it starts to unravel further down the road, because you can get into kind of the design and prototyping stage of a digital platform, but because the stakeholder management hasn't been done correctly, you're missing key stakeholders in the journey, and that can actually slow the pipeline down. The other thing I would do is take that exact same stakeholder map and then do a RACI over it, understanding who would be responsible, accountable, who do you consult, and who do you inform all the way, across that process. But don't do it as just a tick box exercise at the beginning of a project. You actually want to be going back in, because what you'll find is as you roll the project out, other stakeholders will come to light. You don't know what you don't know. And you've got to be open to that, to actually expanding that portfolio and changing potentially some of the RACI as you drive through the actual project. And then you've got to look at it from a post perspective and say, how do I circle back and who's important for the ending of this project as well? So there's quite a lot to take in there. As I said, there's a whole myriad of available options from a a research perspective, Thomas talked about that a little bit earlier, and so did Richard, around how important it is to actually understand your customer and their emotional state. Particularly, you know, with something like with train lines, I can imagine the response is quite visceral. I'm hoping it's not so bad in Thomas's world with pharmaceutical, but you never know. Banking is much the same. So banking has a massive emotional quotient attached to it. How you feel about your financial trusted partner is very, very important. So again, being able to read that, understand it, and actually design for it. There's a lovely saying which says something along the lines of, you know, if you fail to design for emotion in your journeys, irrespective of whether that's digital, inhuman, whatever it might be, your clients will design it for you. You know, they still have an experience, whether you've chosen to own it or not. So yeah, the stakeholder mapping and RACI, absolutely key.
Okay, so big takeout there for an agency, I guess, is look beyond the project team to the wider stakeholders in the organization and really explore what their want and what their experience can bring to the project.
Yeah,
So,
the stakeholders are a wide bunch usually, I think, wider
Yeah.
than you initially think. And from my time in agencies, which I have spent time in agencies, is when you're doing a pitch, you do tend to focus sometimes a bit narrow, and you don't look at it. I always say to people, it's not about verticals, it's about horizontals now. And then it's about, you know, because a vertical to me is let's build a website. Horizontally, it's all the people involved and what do they actually want or need? Do they actually need a website? Is often a question. If you're being honest, half the time they don't. You know, they just need a more accurate email regime. You know, I don't know. It's just, and then stick a load of probability into things. And this is the other thing that I bring with me from the sort of tech side, I guess, is that every action has a load of knock-on effects. So you've got to work out what the knock-on effects are likely to be, and you've got to work out the probability of those knock-on effects. So you look at it very much from a systems point of view as well. And I think that's not spoken about enough when people are briefed to build communications channels. Once the email's gone out, what then?
Yeah.
Once they've come and done a search, what then? You know, and what does each single interaction offer in the way of next steps? And that's complicated UX. You know, that's taking UX a step down into maths.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'll shut up.
Yeah. So, Thomas, when you're in discovery, how do you go about exploring customer needs? Do you carry out interviews? Do you use early stage user testing? How do you really set in stone or clarify exactly what the end goal is for users?
Yeah, all of the above, really. I mean, user interviews, user testing, and user testing, I feel, is something that needs to be done throughout the entire project and not just at the start. It's something that continuously going back and saying, are assumptions the correct assumptions as well? And I think another part, and that kind of comes back to what Jeanette said earlier, is yes, we focus on customers and we focus on customer research, but quite often as a digital team, and I'll be the first one to admit it in our case, is that we don't understand the business as well as some of the people outside of the digital team. We as an organization are very proud of the fact that a lot of our technical support teams, people who are on the road, customer facings, are veterinarians themselves as well. So they understand the industry, they understand the customers far better than I will as an ex-art historian now working in digital. So in that way, I think that getting them involved in the project at key stages is very important as well, because they might be able to give a certain angle or say, well, why aren't we offering these services? And then you can test those ideas with customers still to validate them. But it also makes sure that other parts of the business get involved and get emotionally attached to your project or emotionally involved with your project as well, which obviously helps later down the line when you're rolling out your project. The paradox there is, though, that usually that those are people that know your product, they know your brand, they know your customer really well. But quite often what you then get is, how do we talk about our brand? How do we talk about our products? And not so much about what's the problem the customer wants to solve, you know, away from your brand, away from your product as well. So there's almost that balance you need to find with getting people involved in the project, but also getting people to take on that mindset where they step away from their own brand and product and really try to understand that, you know, what is it that the customer is actually looking for, and also make people aware of the fact that if we don't offer that solution, one of our competitors will probably be able to offer that solution in a better way. So it's very interesting in that discovery stage, because you're both, you know, looking at your customers, but you're also very much trying to get external or internal stakeholders that sit outside of the digital team involved in the project as well.
Yeah, of course. And I guess from there on, it's the balance is to how much you involve them at what points, without overstepping the line of too much too much involvement or too little. So at discovery,
well, I think if you get too much information, you've got to be the expert at sifting that.
Yeah.
You know, and I think it's down to you. I mean, this is what I'm talking about with things like complexity and systems, in that you've got to be aware, if you've got this big pile of stuff, that you've got to make sense of it. It almost doesn't matter, because some companies you're going to get loads of stuff and others you're not. And no matter what you do, you're not going to get more out of some companies than you get, you know, than you get given. And you can go and do research. When we rebuilt the Royal Shakespeare Company website, you know, I remember myself and John, this guy I was working with, we went and sat in the theatres, in the foyers, and just asked people to play. And we sort of recorded it on the iPad, you know, and just watched them playing with the site. And actually that gave us enough information to show where the hesitancy points were. And if you go to that site, they're still using the one we built sort of 7 or 8 years later. And it's actually really easy to use. And that is because we knew we had people in their 80s, people in their 50s, people in their 30s, people from other countries, you know, and it was almost impossible to gather the information for people of that sort of range. And at the same time, we had to satisfy the artistic director. So I'm reporting into the artistic director and the CEO, and these people are running a major cultural institution. They know what they want, you know, and so it was a range of balances. But I found the great equalizer was sitting with people in the theatres, just letting them play. Yeah,
of course. In the environment where they're actually
all in the right
environment.
They could have been Canadian, they could have been German, you know, whatever. They turned up to the theatre to see Shakespeare in his home, and so they were very excited. So that helped.
Just obviously with discovery, I mean, at Cuba we talk with a load of stuff, and I think the challenge is sometimes distilling that into some kind of documentation or output that steers the project and gives you something by which the project is accountable by. So in terms of, it's a bit of a boring question, but in terms of documentation, what are your must-haves that you need in order to manage risk, but also to set the project in the right direction? Once you've done discovery, what are the things you have to see and sign off?
First, because I tend to, I'm also in charge of governance where I am, and I'm driving a lot of the governance. I'm not in charge of it, there's nobody in charge of it, but I drive a lot of it through a design authority. And I've tried to keep the documentation to its minimum. So my feeling is that each department and each set of people involved in the development of something should arrive at a form of documentation that suits the way they work and what they're being asked to do. And then there should be a layer on top that just occasionally says, justify what you've done, right? So I've got a very light touch design authority that just asks for a brief, a technical impact assessment and a technical design at the minute. And above that, then we've got something similar with UX and CX, but basically we end up with a load of user journeys. I mean, it's nothing revolutionary, is it? These are the types of people we've got using the train, the archetypes, and these are the typical things they do. And then underneath it, we map the tech to that. And then that's checked. Does that make sense technically? Does it make sense with customers? etc. But documentation, I think, is relatively light. But the main reason we document is for the people that come after us and for new people joining, and to show people and to share experience, because in a lot of ways, sometimes documentation isn't actually needed to fulfill the task. And this is where Agile's crumbling, you know, because Agile tried to take a certain way and has been badly misinterpreted by people in lots of ways. And we're almost coming into an era now of JFDI, I think. But you need to document what you need to document in order to retain the knowledge in the business, and also to be able to articulate the knowledge to customers, to stakeholders, etc. And I think you've got to decide how much that is.
Yeah. How do you decide on that, Jeanette, in terms of what you want to see in order to make sure the project is being controlled and risks are being managed?
So I absolutely love Richard's approach, and I almost want to ask him to preach the Bible wherever he goes, because I think that big corporations get absolutely stuck on this spot.
If you want me to come and talk, if you're a big bank, it's 50 grand for the day.
Oh, well, there goes my budget, Richard. What can I say? What I want to say is that I think that businesses get stuck here. So it's a bit like the old analogy of analysis paralysis, right? You can get yourself into real trouble with documentation. I think there's a good balance to be had between an outsourced party, like a provider that you've brought in to do a piece of delivery, their need for documentation, because that then plays back into, have we done our job correctly? You know, here, and it's that lovely adage of, here's the scope, did we deliver? Tick the box, pay the bill. You know, and that's one set of documentation. The type that Richard's talking about is, how do you sustain a project beyond the people that have been in that kind of build phase, and how do you actually share that knowledge quite openly? For me, it's more to do with, have we managed to fulfill what the user customer, and again, I don't like the term user, I like the term customer, because I think you've got internal and external customers, and quite often you have both. So have we done something by developing this project that answers what a customer needed, or you know, it created less friction in their journey, or whatever it might be? So for me, the documentation is typically around the measurement of that. And then it's twofold. It's the measurement of, did it do what it said on the tin? In other words, you know, we went to go and fix this. Did it do it? Yes or no? And it's kind of a black or white answer, in my opinion. It's not kind of, because kind of to me tells me we haven't done it properly. And then the next part of that is, what's the evolution of it? So where do we take it from here? Does it evolve? Is there scope for it to actually evolve? And then what does that measurement criteria look like going forward? So documentation can take many forms, but as I said, I think the primary question is about, how do we get paid as a supplier? And the point here is, a supplier will always want to have a clear set of documentation, because otherwise, you know, it becomes a bit muddy trying to figure out when you get paid for what.
Yeah. That's an interesting point. I mean, Thomas, do you set, in the kind of documentation you get from your agency, do you expect them to clearly set out what they expect the return to be in terms of performance? Or is that something that's a little bit more fuzzy at that stage? And, you know, how are you setting KPIs, I guess, in terms of what you're going to get?
I think, I mean, this is really good questions. I was very much listening very intently to Richard and Jeanette just now, because if there's one thing that we've been historically bad at, it's documentation previously, both in our own case and internally, but also in dealing with our external vendors. So it's a very interesting one, even though it sounds maybe a bit boring on the surface. It's a very interesting discussion. When we set out with the project, I think, you know, sometimes it is very difficult to immediately set KPIs, especially if we're working with an agency currently to help us set KPIs for our marketing performance, because we don't really have any customer experience metrics yet set up. So I think the stage that we're at in terms of a digital maturity, it's far more about setting clear deliverables and creating that very clear statement of work as to what is it that we're agreeing to do. How do we, what are our timelines as well? When are we aiming to deliver this? And what do we expect to get out of this at the end as well? And fortunately, we've partnered up with a couple of very strong agency partners that help us set those guidelines and help us, in that process as well. And I think even better sometimes is when agencies themselves say, hey, we know that you don't have any documentation. We will help you set this up for the people that come after this, or if you actually get in-house capability to pick this up and rationalize some of the design choices that we've made.
That's an interesting point you raised, because it's kind of taking us into that area of scope creep in terms of, you're setting timelines, you're setting budgets and deliverables. Ultimately, things don't always go to plan, and scope creep is the kind of dreaded term, leastwise from the agency side. So it'd be interesting to understand from each of you, your experience of scope creep. How from a client's perspective, how do you manage that, or how do you expect your agency to manage it? And that's a big element of risk, scope creep, in lots of respects. So it'd be interesting just to get your thoughts on that, if that's possible. Richard, if I could start with you.
It's an absolute bloody nightmare.
Right.
It just happens. It doesn't matter where. I can assure you, every sector I've worked in, it just happens, right? No matter what. As you develop something, you start to think, oh, maybe it should do this. And it's somebody somewhere in the chain thinks that, and it starts to grow. And I think as you realize something, obviously the product owner or product manager looks at it and thinks, actually, that's really good, but wouldn't it be great if it did this? And I think this is what mistakenly a lot of people assumed Agile could deal with. Not realizing Agile was really a software development methodology. It's quite a limited thing. They thought it meant that after 2 weeks they'd be able to stand back and go, maybe we should do this. I remember having a client at a large international corporation who refused to let us work Agile as an agency, because she said she never knew when something was arriving. You couldn't give a deadline with full proper Agile, and it's absolutely true, because it's this software methodology, not really a product methodology. And I think scope creep comes from all of that, seeing what it is. It's very hard. I mean, if you had a brief and you asked people to draw the homepage for that brief, everybody would draw something different. And so whichever way they're thinking what's going to happen is going to be different. And this is the tension. And I think how you deal with it, you just deal with it. You just have to keep chipping away. There's no actual magic formula. I'm sorry, that's taking it too far. And the easiest way of stopping scope creep is just to enforce your budget. I'm sorry, we can't do that. It's just too expensive. I'm never going to get another bloody business case through for that. We've been given £800,000, £1 million, whatever, to do this project. I can't go back and ask for another 500,000 unless it's absolutely desperate. But then your business case is more compelling. But if you do that, it does actually limit scope creep, but it doesn't limit the small scope creep. The Baroque frills, the Rococo frills on the edges, they're constantly changing.
Yeah. Do you think scope creep is inherently not necessarily a bad thing, but it has benefits,
Well, I view things through complexity and systems lenses. So to me, scope creep is part of an emergent. They just emerge. They're going to emerge from a complex system. So you've just got to work out how you best manage it. You can't control it, but you can manage it. Yeah. This is the thing to remember with complexity. You cannot control complexity, but you can manage the constraints in which it operates to some extent. So I think, we all get this scope creep stuff wrong. There's always scope creep. It just happens. There's stuff you can't control. Just takes on a life of its own. But that, to me, is something to be jumped on and ridden.
Yeah.
It's emerging for a very good reason, usually. So
So-
maybe you could just flip the way you're looking at it and stop trying to be a controller and just try to be a conductor in an orchestra, making sure everything balances continually.
I love the conductor analogy. I think if I had to conduct some orchestras throughout digital design and development, it would sound something like heavy metal and not an orchestra.
Well, I think some of it does. When you do projects, they play in one key,
Yeah.
one tempo,
Yeah.
and they just go, whereas some other projects, if you actually deal with it properly, are more like symphonic structures in that they're up, they're down, they're slow, the timbres change, the key changes that are actually in harmony. That's the other thing with the musical analogy. Sometimes people are going along in F and they'll jump to E flat, which is an unexpected jump. And if you start to think like that, you kind of start to see it as a form rather than just a set of
A flat
hurdles.
piece. Yeah, 100%.
See the whole system,
And I agree wholeheartedly. I don't think that scope creep is always a negative. I think the negative comes in typically from a design agency perspective, because they struggle to manage it from a resourcing perspective. So you've got budget constraints, you've got resource constraints, you've got delivery constraints. We talked a little bit earlier about documentation. It's often I'll do this, you do that, we'll get to this point and I get paid. Where scope creep kind of says, I'll do this. Oh no, hold on. I'm also going to be doing that. And you're going to be doing this. And hang on, something else has changed here. What does that mean for me in terms of managing the expectations? Because at the end of the day, an agency is only as good as the last project they've delivered, right? And you have to get to the delivery bit for it to be a success. So I have a slightly different view in that. And I think that part of the journey is actually the bit that you need to enjoy. I talked earlier about doing stakeholder mapping. I think that if you've done really good stakeholder mapping and you've done really good discovery and exploration and ideation right at the beginning, a lot of your scope creep can be mitigated. The big scope creep can be mitigated because you're quite not controlling, as Richard would say, but you're quite open to managing all the octopuses that come out of the cupboard, because literally one idea will start to spark another one, and you never want to stop that creative process. You want people to feel engaged with your project. I think the challenge does come where Richard says, oh, but I only have X amount of money. So which of these things are we going to prioritize? Prioritization has to come back to, in my opinion, what is most valuable for the job to be done in terms of the delivery of this particular piece of work. And that has to be prioritized. And they can be bolt-ons, which are done later. So it's not to say that all ideas are good ideas or all ideas are bad ideas, but some ideas may need a little bit of time in the background to be parked and bolted into a phase 2, which you can then go back for a business case to say, hey, during discovery, this is what we found. And we had so many great ideas. I mean, I'm doing a project at the moment where that's exactly what's happening. I thought I had it all pat down. And the reality of it is when I went back into the business, another wave of great ideas came back out. And I'm just unreluctant to kind of go, I'm going to shut those down and stick it into a V2. I want to do it now because I think it's the right thing to do. And lastly, Matthew, not to labor the point, I really do think that having this open relationship right up front with your suppliers and your internal teams is key. So understanding that it's not a swear word, it's not a bad thing, it's part of the evolution of most projects. Have you ever been on a project, Matthew, where you've not had scope creep? So it's an accepted fact, right? It's an accepted norm. Get it out in front right at the beginning. Don't treat it like it's a bad thing. Embrace it and understand how you can go with the flow to a certain degree.
Yeah. That's an interesting point, because inherently agencies, like to control these things and keep a lid on things. So it's something that we don't necessarily embrace. But I completely agree with the it shouldn't smother ideas. I mean, just with you, Thomas, working with your agency, so, for example, in the design stages, where design can often run away a bit with iterations, and it's very subjective. Is that an area for you in terms of, is that where things get scope creepy in particular, or is it something that's easy to manage for you?
Well, I think So I think Jeanette just said it all. One of the beautiful things is that almost digital products nowadays are open-ended, and you don't need to have like a finite solution or a perfect solution in one go, because of all the you can build on what you create as your part one, as your phase one. And our agency supported us in that and saying that we have kind of three different horizons. The first horizon is just modernizing, which is basically kind of rebuilding what we currently have with some user experience changes, with some added functionality, but then also allowing us the space to then say, well, let's start scoping out phase two, which are a lot more risky, a lot more unknown, and a lot more grand almost in what we're trying to achieve. And then the horizon three is beyond that. But I think that's where we're almost lucky nowadays with how digital products are working, is that if we set a deadline for what we set out, then it's not that we can't bolt on anything to that product anymore once it's been delivered. We can extend that product out over the years. And I think that goes back to how do we keep the web solutions or digital solutions alive once they're launched as well. So scope creep for me isn't even, as long as you kind of take that mindset of saying, right, we are committing to delivering phase one right now, but we have an open mind as to discussing what can come beyond phase two. I don't even think scope creep is necessarily,
I think that's it. It's part of life now, and that's the end.
Yeah.
And what we talked about, we had a previous quick call to prepare for this a little bit, and we talked there about evolution of products and how things are evolutionary now, rather than just get to the point where you publish a brochure online or a machine online, and leave it there. They no longer are. Whatever you build that's online is evolutionary. It changes with the traffic. And therefore, you're absolutely right. And this is the art of managing what we would have called scope creep. And just understanding at this point we do this, at this point we do that. I think you're spot on.
Yeah, that's a good point, because often we think, okay, the project's done, we're all happy with it, let's move on now, and that's often when.
Well, that's the metaphor I think I used in our sort of warm-up call. That often people think of things like designing an ocean liner, and they design it. They find the steel workers, they find the shipyards, they get the boat out into the dock, and that's it, But actually, the biggest part of the job is when that sets sail. It has to crew, it has to dock, it has to work journeys, it has to be repaired, it has a life cycle, which is a far bigger project than actually getting it into the dock in the first place. So when you launch something, I think it's almost psychologically treated as the end of the process, but it's actually the beginning.
So there's a risk of complacency, essentially, of everybody, all teams, whether or not it's client or agency, that once something's been released, it's easy to sit back and just
I think there's a sense of relief, isn't there?
Well, there is.
And there's certainly some booze that night. But yeah, I think that is equivalent of a ship, though. You slam the champagne, you drink the champagne, it's going, but from then on, that's the hard work.
Yeah.
I think also from then on, it's the proof of the case. So the reality of it is that from a project perspective, if you work in a project cycle environment, the project has been delivered in theory. And I say that in theory. That evolution piece we've been kind of bantering around. I'm a big fan of how things are worded. So in my mind, creep to start with is a really horrible word. And I think that I would even go so far as to start off with, how do we talk about project evolution? Because it's not about creep. It's about, you'll often start with a single concept. And by the time you're ready to go and start with kind of phase one delivery, that concept has morphed, it's evolved. And that's not a bad thing. That's actually a good thing, and it should be celebrated. I think the only caveat here is that when you're dealing with outside parties, you need to ensure that they're aware of it. You build in some kind of buffer in the funding elements and the budgets behind it so that you can allow it, because otherwise it feels quite constrained from an agency perspective, where, you're trying to deliver apples and now you want an orchard, and that's the kind of difference, I think.
Yeah. I like the use of the term evolution as opposed to creep. We're going to introduce that. But Thomas, is there anything in terms of when you've launched a product or your website, how, in terms of making sure that performance is continued and it's not forgotten about? How do you work with your agency in making sure that things evolve, they don't stand still?
I mean, I think quite often it comes back to, to points that were made earlier as well about being able to communicate with stakeholders internally and making sure, it's not just a digital team. It then, once it's launched, once it's live and it becomes that living, breathing product, agencies can have a role to play if you are looking more kind of like a marketing or a customer engagement type agency, but quite often it's just your internal people outside of the digital team, people that own the content, people that own the customer relations to then make the most of it. And I think I completely agree with Jeanette about that product evolution concept as well. I think that's where agencies can really play a role. Quite often I think there's that negative idea from a client side about agencies as to they're trying to lock you in, they're trying to get your money, your budget, but in the end, what it is about kind of that building out that long-term partnership with agencies and making sure that they understand the business and understand what you want to do, and you're paying them for their expertise as well. So, the discussions that we've had with the agency that's helping us to deliver the new web project has been very much about the longer term and saying, right, where do we go from here, and how do we make sure that the systems and technology underpinning this also create some of our business, or also solve some of our business experience challenges as well, so we can encourage the people within the business to take ownership of their content in a less time-consuming way, because not everyone is wired in a way that they easily put web pages together or easily put content on a website. So I think from there, the agency's role in that is, first of all, support with the design, the overall kind of delivery of the product. But a good agency will always give that longer term support as well as saying, what does product evolution, as Jeanette just called it, look like as well, and not worry about scope creep, because I agree that's a bit of a nasty word almost.
Yeah. There's a question from John which relates to MVP, minimum viable product. Where do you stand in terms of your view on defining an MVP and sticking to it? Because we talked about evolution, but at the end of the day, being realistic about what can be achieved is actually really quite important, and budgets and times and all the rest of it. So do you really stick to an MVP? Is that something that is a benchmark for you in delivering a project? Richard, if I can kick off with you on this one.
MVPs are an interesting thing. I almost think that's almost outdated anyway as a sort of concept. It's part of the whole agile movement, and I think basically, I think once you get into this evolutionary mindset, it's almost, again, MVP really is the successful test piece, to my mind, where you get to a point where you test something to the point where, could we switch this on, could we not? And that really is it. But from that point onwards, I think if we take this evolution metaphor, you've got to kind of allow the thing to adapt and grow after that. So I think it comes down to, at what point do we switch the first version of this service on? And that, to me, is whatever you want to call it. MVP, do you want to call it a 2.0? Do you want to call it a beta? I don't really care. The point is, that's the start at which you dump the animal in the environment and you start to allow it to adapt. So I think if you go down that systems complexity and evolutionary approach, terms like that are almost last decade. I know people still use it, and I know why they use it, but I don't know what an MVP actually is. It's I know it's minimum viable product, but surely that's the thing you first switch on.
If I can jump in here, I would have gone MVP is your first prototype. It's the first one you put into market to do some test and iteration on.
Yeah, that's an interesting point.
And
Yeah.
it's very, MVP for me is often not a great experience. So you've got to be really careful about where you release it and how you release it, because your audience's first interaction with your platform will leave a lasting emotional imprint. And I want to talk about emotion because I think it's really important. We did talk a little bit about it earlier. Richard, with his visceral, emotional clients on their journeys. Imagine if the first MVP put out on the LNER app was half-baked. You know, it was that first prototype and he went public with it. The reality of that is it would add to the emotional.
You damage your business.
100%, but also you would damage the impression of the business overall,
absolutely,
because of the emotional kind of imprint that gets attached to it. So everything you release from there on out has the capacity to either continue to erode the emotional footprint, or it continues to slightly improve it. So MVP for me it's a pilot approach. It's part of the design thinking approach. It's your first prototype that you take out.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because it's a prototype. We've only got a couple of minutes left, and one of the things that we talk about in a lot at Cuba is technology and the technology choices we make. And I know this is a big topic to kind of wrap up within a couple of minutes, so it's a tricky one, but it's something that is obviously a big spend. It's a long-term commitment. In a nutshell, which is almost impossible, any major advice for making the right technology choice?
Yeah. When you're choosing it, think about what you're going to do next time you choose it. So we choose this now. What complications is that going to give us 5 years down the line when we upgrade?
That's a good point.
And that actually, for me as an architect, is the biggest problem, because there's so much technology out there can do what you want. You know, the choice is really ultimately down to you and what. It's like going into Starbucks, isn't it? It's all coffee, but people buy completely radically different flavors to put in it to make it taste differently. So you end up queuing for about 20 minutes when it should have been 2 minutes. Just give me a coffee. They've got a macchiato warm and wet or whatever. And that's the same with technology. There's loads of flavors of the technology. The question is, at the end of the 5-year period, how difficult will it be to upgrade, remove, and how much will it cost to keep it running in the meantime? And I think almost the name of the technology is almost irrelevant. You know, it's just those factors, business factors.
Yeah. Thomas, you've made some big technology decisions in recent years. Any advice on how to manage risk in that respect?
Agree with Richard. Really, for me, it's people, product, technology, and quite often in this day and age, technology can be A, B, C. It doesn't really matter that much anymore. But the most important thing, I think, is very much what, the element of, can we get rid of it if we have to, and how easy is that? And I think that sometimes also very much fits within the conversation we have around working together with agencies. It's fine for an agency to suggest a solution, and I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, we went with the solution that the agency suggested for us, but also after looking into, well, is this actually the solution that is an industry standard and something that can easily be either removed as a product by itself or can be allocated to a different resource if that would be necessary as well. So the technology in itself, I think, is not really that big of a question anymore. In the end, it comes down to factors like cost, but also very much about what are we doing in the long term? How does this fit in with our, with our enterprise architecture? And can we, if we have to, replace it easily or put it with a different partner to work with?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and Jeanette, anything finally on technology from your perspective before we wrap up?
I would just echo both what Richard and Thomas have said, and just to say, consider where your client might be in 5 years from now and what their accessibility to that technology might look like. And then lastly, the geographical implications of that technology, whether or not if you're designing globally for different cultures and different accessibility points, you need to consider that as well.
Lovely. Thank you very much for that. And actually, thank you very much, all three of you. You've been a fantastic panel.
We did have a question in the chat window, but he's gone now, so he's just left. So it
Was
doesn't
that
matter.
the MVP one?
Yeah.
I think we tackled
He's
it.
gone. So
Yeah.
that's actually John, who I mentioned at the Royal Shakespeare Company. So.
Right. Okay. I think we tackled the MVP.
Yeah, we did fairly thoroughly. Yeah.
So yeah, thank you very much for joining us today. You've been a fantastic panel, some great insights. Really enjoyed it, and thank you everybody for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you at a future event from Cuba.
Thank you, everybody. It was great being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.